Let me see some ID.
For what? I'm just standing outside my building.
People like you don't usually deal with banks like this. Let me see it.
I'm gonna have lunch. I'm not handing you my
Sir,
ID.
if you don't show me right now, things are going to get real bad for you.
You know what? Here, I'm the bank.
Officer Lucas Ward had barely 11 months on the job when he destroyed his future in broad daylight, standing right in front of a Miami financial institution for absolutely nothing. He saw a black man in a fitted black suit walking toward the front entrance of the bank. No crime, no call, no suspicious activity. But in Ward's mind, that alone was enough. Bias replaced logic. Assumption replaced evidence. And ego replaced law. That black man was Calvin Brooks, a respected senior bank manager with 19 years in U.S. banking compliance and federal regulated risk evaluation. What happened next would trigger state investigation, financial regulatory review pressure, civil rights litigation, and eventually cost this rookie cop $3.5 million. Before we continue, where are you watching from? If this is your first time here, please hit that subscribe button. Stories like these need to be shared, and your support helps us bring more truth to light. Miami in late July 2024 was unforgiving. The heat doesn't just touch your skin, it presses against you, thick and humid, making every breath feel like work. By 11 in the morning, the temperature had already climbed past 90 degrees. The kind of heat that makes asphalt shimmer and forces people to move with deliberate slowness. Downtown Miami's financial district operates with a particular rhythm. Glass towers reflect the brutal sunlight. Men and women in business attire move between buildings with purpose. Black cars idle at curbs. Security guards stand at entrances. Everything runs on schedules, protocols, and expectations. Officer Lucas Ward was patrolling this district on foot that morning. He had been with the Miami Police Department for 11 months, long enough to feel confident in the uniform, but not long enough to understand the weight of the authority it carried. Rookies often occupy this dangerous middle ground. The nervousness of the academy has worn off, but the wisdom that comes from experience hasn't yet developed. Ward's body cam was active. It had been recording since the start of his shift, capturing everything from his perspective: the sidewalks, the storefronts, the faces of people passing by. The camera doesn't lie. It doesn't editorialize. It simply records what happens in front of it. At 11:17 a.m., the camera captured Calvin Brooks. Brooks was walking toward the entrance of Coastal Federal Bank, a mid-sized regional institution that served both retail customers and commercial clients. He wore a fitted black suit, tailored precisely to his frame. His shoes were polished. His briefcase was leather. Everything about his appearance communicated professionalism, success, and belonging. But Ward didn't see any of that. The body cam footage shows Ward's head turning, tracking Brooks' movement across the sidewalk. There's a pause. A moment of assessment. Then Ward changes direction, moving to intercept. Brooks hadn't run. He hadn't looked around nervously. He hadn't done anything that would constitute suspicious behavior under any reasonable interpretation of law enforcement protocol. He was simply walking toward the building where he worked. Ward approached from the side, positioning himself between Brooks and the entrance. "Excuse me," Ward said, his voice carrying that particular tone of casual authority that officers use when they want compliance without having to demand it explicitly. Brooks stopped. He looked at Ward with the expression of someone who has experienced this before. Not surprise, not confusion, just weary recognition. "Can I help you with something, officer?" Brooks asked. "What's your business here?" Ward replied. It was an interesting choice of words. Not "can I ask you a question?" Not "do you have a moment?" But a demand for justification. For explanation. For proof that Brooks had a legitimate reason to be exactly where he was. "I'm going to work," Brooks said simply. "Work where?" Brooks gestured toward the bank entrance. "Here." Ward's expression shifted slightly. The body cam caught it. A tightening around the eyes, a subtle change in posture. He didn't believe it. "People like you don't deal with these kind of banks," Ward said. The words came out easily, casually, as if they were obvious. As if the statement required no justification because the logic was self-evident. Brooks went very still. This is the moment where racism reveals itself most clearly. Not in violence, not in aggression, but in presumption. In the casual certainty that someone's race determines their capabilities, their status, their right to occupy certain spaces. Ward had made a determination based on nothing but appearance. A black man in a suit, walking toward a bank, must be explained, must be questioned. Must prove he belongs. The body cam continued recording. The Miami Heat pressed down, and a routine Monday morning was about to become a career-ending mistake. Do you think he approached that calm if the bank manager was white? Calvin Brooks had worked in banking for 19 years. He had started as a teller in Atlanta, worked his way through operations, moved into compliance, and eventually specialized in federal risk evaluation. His expertise included Bank Secrecy Act regulations, anti-money laundering protocols, FDIC compliance frameworks, and federal regulatory reporting requirements. He was not just an employee. He was senior management. He reported directly to the regional director. His decisions affected lending policies, regulatory filings, and the bank's relationship with federal oversight agencies. But standing on that Miami sidewalk, none of that mattered to Officer Lucas Ward. "I need to see some identification," Ward said. Brooks didn't reach for his wallet. "Am I being detained?" It was the same question Daryl Monroe had asked in New York. The same question that every person who understands their constitutional rights asks when confronted by law enforcement without clear cause. It's not defiance. It's clarity, an attempt to establish the legal framework of the encounter. "I'm conducting an investigation," Ward replied. "An investigation into what?" Brooks asked. "That's not your concern right now." "Actually, it is my concern," Brooks said calmly. "If you're detaining me, you need reasonable, articulable suspicion that I've committed, am committing, or am about to commit a crime. If you're not detaining me, then this is a consensual encounter and I'm free to leave." Ward's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being challenged. More importantly, he wasn't prepared for someone who knew the law better than he did. "Don't get smart with me," Ward said. "I'm not being smart. I'm asking a legal question. And I'm telling you I need to see ID. And I'm telling you that without reasonable suspicion, I'm not required to provide it." The body cam footage shows the tension escalating in real time, not through raised voices or physical movement, but through the invisible battle of wills. Ward needed compliance to maintain his authority. Brooks refused to surrender his rights to ease Ward's ego. This is where the encounter could have ended. Ward could have stepped back. He could have acknowledged that Brooks had broken no law, exhibited no suspicious behavior, and posed no threat. He could have apologized for the confusion and moved on with his day. But that would have required Ward to admit he had made a mistake. And for officers like Ward, young, insecure, overinvested in the performance of authority, that admission felt impossible. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," Ward said. "I'm standing here answering your questions," Brooks replied. "I haven't refused to speak with you. I've simply asked you to articulate a legal basis for demanding my identification." Ward took a step closer. The body cam angle shifted, capturing Brooks' face more clearly. His expression remained neutral, controlled, but the tension in his shoulders was visible. This was a man preparing for the situation to deteriorate. "Last chance," Ward said. "Show me ID or you're getting detained." "On what charge?" "Obstruction." "Obstruction of what investigation?" "You haven't told me what crime you're investigating." Ward's hand moved to his belt, hovering near his handcuffs. It was a physical threat, a signal that compliance was no longer optional. Brooks didn't move. He didn't step back. He didn't reach for anything. He just stood there, breathing carefully, calculating his options. This is the impossible position that Black Americans are forced into constantly. Comply and surrender your rights. Resist and risk violence. There's no safe choice. No path that guarantees dignity and safety simultaneously. The body cam recorded everything. The positioning. The body language. The slow escalation from question to demand to threat. Ward was making his case for him. Every moment of footage documented the absence of reasonable suspicion. Every word demonstrated the racial presumption driving the encounter. Every gesture revealed an officer more concerned with dominance than law. But in that moment, standing in the Miami heat with an officer reaching for handcuffs, Calvin Brooks knew that documentation wouldn't protect him from what might happen next. Why are Black men expected to prove legitimacy before any crime even exists? To understand why this encounter was unlawful from the moment it began, you need to understand three fundamental legal concepts that govern police authority in the United States. The first is reasonable articulable suspicion, commonly abbreviated as RAS. This is the legal standard established in Terry v. Ohio, a 1968 Supreme Court case that defined when police officers can briefly detain someone for investigation. RAS requires more than a hunch, more than a feeling. It requires specific, articulable facts that would lead a reasonable officer to suspect criminal activity. Walking toward a bank is not RAS. Wearing a suit is not RAS. Being black is not RAS, though decades of litigation and documented patterns suggest it functions that way far too often in practice. The second concept is probable cause. This is a higher standard than reasonable suspicion. Probable cause exists when facts and circumstances would lead a reasonable person to believe that a crime has been committed and that a specific person committed it. Probable cause is required for arrest, for search warrants, for charges that deprive someone of their liberty. Officer Ward had neither RAS nor probable cause. He had assumption. The third concept is particularly relevant to Calvin Brooks' situation. Federal banking positions are not casual employment. Senior managers in federally regulated financial institutions operate under strict oversight. They hold positions that require background checks, federal regulatory approval, and ongoing compliance with statutes including the Bank Secrecy Act, the USA Patriot Act, and FDIC regulations. Calvin Brooks wasn't just a bank employee. He was a compliance officer whose role was defined and protected by federal statute. His authority to access sensitive financial information, to file suspicious activity reports, to interface with federal regulators made his position fundamentally different from standard private sector employment. This matters legally because interference with a federal officer or employee in the performance of their duties carries specific consequences. It matters practically because Brooks possessed credentials that identified him as operating within a federally regulated framework. But Ward didn't ask about credentials. He didn't inquire about employment. He simply assumed that a black man couldn't possibly hold a legitimate position at a financial institution and demanded proof of belonging before any evidence of wrongdoing existed. This is the core of discriminatory policing, the belief that certain people must justify their presence in certain spaces. That suspicion is the default rather than the exception, that the burden of proof falls on the citizen rather than on the officer who initiates the encounter. Terry v. Ohio was intended to give police a tool for brief investigative stops when genuine suspicion exists. But in practice, it has been weaponized, used to justify stops based on demographics rather than behavior, transformed from a narrow exception into a broad license for the kind of pretextual policing that leads to encounters like the one Calvin Brooks experienced. Legal scholars have written extensively about Terry stops and their disproportionate application in communities of color. The data is overwhelming. Black and Latino individuals are stopped at rates far exceeding their white counterparts, even when controlling for crime rates, location, and time of day. The stops often follow the same pattern Ward demonstrated. Vague justifications, manufactured suspicion, demands for compliance without legal basis. And when the target of the stop knows their rights and refuses to submit, escalation. Ward should have been trained on these concepts. Every police officer in the United States receives instruction on reasonable suspicion, probable cause, and constitutional limits on law enforcement authority. But training and practice are not the same thing. In the moment, standing in front of that bank, Ward wasn't thinking about Terry v. Ohio or the Fourth Amendment or federal banking regulations. He was thinking about control, about authority, about forcing Calvin Brooks to acknowledge his power. That impulse, the need to dominate rather than serve, is what transforms policing from a public service into an occupation force. Should a cop be certified every 18 months on federal credential recognition training? Officer Lucas Ward reached for Calvin Brooks' arm. It wasn't a violent grab. It wasn't a tackle. But it was physical contact, an assertion of authority through touch. The body cam shows Ward's hand extending, fingers spreading to grip Brooks' bicep and establish control. Brooks pulled his arm back, not aggressively, just enough to maintain personal space, to signal that he was not consenting to the contact. "Do not touch me," Brooks said, his voice still controlled but carrying an edge now. "A warning. You're being detained for obstruction," Ward said, reaching again. And that's when Brooks reached into his jacket pocket. The movement was slow, deliberate, designed to avoid triggering the kind of panicked response that has gotten black men killed during police encounters. Brooks pulled out a leather credential wallet and flipped it open. Inside was his bank identification badge, his federal banking compliance officer certification, his FDIC-related credentials that authorized him to access sensitive regulatory information and interface with federal oversight agencies. He held it directly in front of Ward's body cam. "I am the senior bank manager at this institution," Brooks said quietly. "I have worked here for 7 years. I hold federal compliance certifications that required background checks and regulatory approval. You approached me while I was walking to my place of employment. You demanded identification without reasonable suspicion. You threatened me with arrest for asserting my constitutional rights. And you just attempted physical detention without probable cause." Ward's hand froze in mid-reach. The body cam captured his face. The exact moment the realization hit. The slow comprehension that he hadn't stopped a suspicious person. He had stopped the bank's senior manager. In front of the bank. While the manager was going to work. The silence stretched. Miami traffic hummed in the background. Pedestrians passed on the sidewalk. The bank's glass doors reflected the morning sun. Ward lowered his hand. "I was just checking," he said weakly. "Checking what?" Brooks asked. "You saw a black man in a suit and decided he must be explained. Must be investigated. Must prove he has a right to enter a building in broad daylight." That's exactly what this was," Brooks interrupted. "And we both know it. And more importantly, your camera knows it." Ward took a step back. He was calculating now, trying to determine if there was any way to salvage the situation. Any explanation that would make this seem reasonable in the report he'd have to file. There wasn't. "Have a good day, officer," Brooks said, closing his credential wallet and walking toward the bank entrance. Ward didn't follow. He just stood there, watching Brooks disappear into the building, knowing that his career had just been destroyed by 11 months of unearned confidence and a lifetime of unexamined bias. The body cam continued recording. It captured Ward standing alone on the sidewalk. It captured him touching his radio, then hesitating. It captured him looking back toward his patrol car, weighing whether to report the encounter or pretend it never happened. But it didn't matter what Ward decided, because Calvin Brooks was already inside the bank, making a phone call to his attorney and downloading his own security footage from the bank's exterior cameras. There would be no hiding from this. No reframing it. No administrative burial. This time, the evidence would speak for itself. Is this where you would have lost your patience if you were Calvin? Calvin Brooks filed his complaint with the Miami Police Department's Internal Affairs Division within 3 hours of the incident. He didn't wait. He didn't hesitate. He understood that time matters in these cases, that officers talk to each other, that stories get coordinated, that the longer you wait, the more opportunity exists for the narrative to shift. His complaint was detailed and precise. It included timestamps from the bodycam footage. It referenced specific constitutional violations. It named Officer Lucas Ward and included his badge number. It requested preservation of all video evidence, including the body cam recording and the bank's external security footage. The internal affairs investigation was mandatory. The evidence was clear. The body cam had documented everything from Ward's initial approach to the moment Brooks revealed his credentials. But as with most police departments facing accusations of officer misconduct, the first instinct was damage control. The Miami Police Department's official statement was careful. They acknowledged that an encounter had occurred. They confirmed that the matter was under investigation. They emphasized that Officer Ward was a relatively new officer still in his probationary period. They noted that all officers receive training on constitutional policing and respectful engagement with the community. What they didn't say was more revealing. They didn't apologize. They didn't acknowledge racial profiling. They didn't commit to any specific consequences for Ward. The statement was designed to sound responsible while admitting nothing. But Calvin Brooks wasn't interested in carefully worded press releases. He was interested in accountability. And he knew that internal investigations rarely produce meaningful consequences unless external pressure forces the issue. So he went public. He gave an interview to a local news station. He authorized the release of the bodycam footage through a public records request. He wrote an opinion piece for a regional newspaper explaining why this wasn't just about him, but about the thousands of black professionals who face similar presumptions daily. The response was immediate. The video went viral. Local civil rights organizations held press conferences. National media outlets picked up the story. Legal commentators analyzed the encounter frame by frame, pointing out each constitutional violation. The pressure mounted. 3 weeks after the incident, Calvin Brooks filed a federal civil rights lawsuit under 42 U.S.C. Section 1983. The complaint named Officer Lucas Ward as a defendant in his individual capacity. It also named the city of Miami, alleging that inadequate training, supervision, and accountability mechanisms had created an environment where racial profiling was tolerated. The complaint sought compensatory damages for the violation of Brooks' Fourth and 14th Amendment rights. It sought punitive damages to deter future misconduct. And it sought injunctive relief requiring reforms to training and accountability procedures. The city's initial response was defensive. They filed a motion to dismiss, arguing qualified immunity for Officer Ward. They claimed that the law regarding Terry stops was not clearly established enough for Ward to know his conduct was unlawful. They suggested that Brooks' refusal to show identification had contributed to the escalation. Every argument was standard. Every defense was predictable. And every assertion ignored the central reality captured on video, that Officer Ward had initiated an unlawful encounter based on racial presumption. The qualified immunity motion failed. The judge found that the law was clearly established that officers cannot detain individuals without reasonable suspicion, and that racial profiling violates the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. Discovery proceeded. Ward was deposed. His testimony was damaging. Under oath, he struggled to articulate any specific behavior that had justified the stop. He admitted that Brooks had been walking normally, not running or acting evasively. He acknowledged that the comment about "people like you" was inappropriate. His attorney tried to rehabilitate him, tried to frame him as a young officer learning the job, tried to suggest that stress and inexperience, rather than bias, had driven his actions. But the body cam footage undermined every attempt at mitigation. The casual confidence in Ward's voice when he made the comment. The immediate assumption that Brooks couldn't possibly work at the bank. The escalation when Brooks asserted his rights. All of it revealed not inexperience, but entitlement. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of a trial that would generate massive publicity, the city of Miami negotiated a settlement. $3.5 million. The number reflected the severity of the violation, the clarity of the evidence, and the city's desire to avoid a trial. It also sent a message, a deliberate signal that this type of conduct carried serious financial consequences. But Brooks negotiated for more than money. The settlement agreement required the Miami Police Department to implement mandatory training on implicit bias and racial profiling. It required supervisory review of body cam footage to identify patterns of discriminatory policing before complaints were filed. It required officers to document articulable facts justifying every investigative stop. Officer Lucas Ward was terminated before the settlement was finalized. His termination paperwork cited violation of department policy, unconstitutional detention, and conduct unbecoming an officer. He was 26 years old. His law enforcement career ended before his second anniversary on the job. And unlike officers who are fired and simply move to another department, Ward's termination and the circumstances surrounding it were now part of the public record. Every background check would reveal it. Every hiring board would see it. His career wasn't just over. It was obliterated. Some people will say that's too harsh, that everyone deserves a second chance, that a young officer shouldn't have his entire future destroyed by one mistake. But Calvin Brooks would remind those people that his future could have been destroyed that day too. That if he had reacted with anger instead of control, if he had physically resisted instead of verbally refusing, if Ward had interpreted any of his movements as threatening, the outcome could have been violence, arrest, charges, or worse. The settlement wasn't about revenge. It was about recognition. Recognition that bias has costs, that constitutional rights matter, that the badge doesn't grant permission to harass people based on racial assumptions. And it was about sending a message to every other officer who might be tempted to make the same assumptions Ward did, that the next Calvin Brooks might also be a federal compliance officer, or a civil rights attorney, or someone with the resources and determination to hold them accountable. Do you think a settlement number actually changes future behavior, or is it just hush money? Calvin Brooks' case ended with accountability. Officer Lucas Ward lost his job. The city of Miami paid millions. Reforms were mandated. Justice, by most measures, was served. But justice in one case doesn't dismantle the system that produced it. The encounter between Ward and Brooks didn't begin the moment the officer approached. It began long before. in training that teaches officers to view certain communities as inherently criminal, in media representations that associate blackness with threat, in historical patterns of policing that have always treated black bodies as subjects of control rather than citizens deserving protection. Ward's bias didn't form in 11 months on the job. It was cultivated over a lifetime, reinforced by culture, media, and the unspoken assumptions that permeate American society. The badge didn't create his prejudice. It simply gave him the authority to act on it. And that's the systemic problem that settlements can't solve. Racism in policing doesn't always announce itself through violence. It doesn't always result in shootings or physical brutality. Sometimes it's just an officer approaching a black professional outside their workplace and demanding they prove they belong. But that presumption, that assumption of criminality, that requirement to justify your presence in spaces you have every right to occupy, that is violence. Slow, corrosive, and cumulative. Calvin Brooks had credentials. He had status. He had resources. And even with all of that, he was still subjected to the same racial profiling that affects Black Americans at every economic level. Because the badge that eventually protected him didn't actually protect him. It exposed Officer Ward. It made the consequences unavoidable. But it didn't prevent the encounter from happening in the first place. This is the reality that people who have never experienced this type of profiling struggle to understand. The exhaustion of constantly being presumed guilty. The burden of having to perform respectability to avoid harassment. The impossibility of ever being seen as simply a person going about your day. The encounters happen thousands of times every day across the United States. Most don't make the news. Most don't result in lawsuits. Most don't have the clear evidence that Brooks' case had. They're just small violations. Brief moments of humiliation. Reminders that your presence in certain spaces will always be questioned. And the officers who conduct these stops often face no consequences because the victims don't have the credentials, resources, or energy to fight back. Brooks went public not because he needed validation, but because he understood that his case represented something larger. That every time an officer like Ward is held accountable, it creates a small deterrent. A moment of hesitation before the next stop. A suggestion that bias carries risk. But deterrence isn't prevention. And accountability after the fact doesn't undo the harm already caused. The reforms mandated by Brooks' settlement were significant. Training on implicit bias. Supervisory review of bodycam footage. Documentation requirements for investigative stops. These measures have value. They create procedural safeguards. They signal institutional awareness of the problem. But they don't change the fundamental culture of policing. They don't address the warrior mentality that teaches officers to view civilians as potential threats. They don't challenge the historical legacy of police serving as enforcers of racial hierarchy. They don't reimagine what public safety could look like if it were built on trust rather than enforcement. Real reform requires more than policy adjustments. It requires confronting uncomfortable truths about why policing exists, who it protects, and who it controls. It requires asking whether the current model of law enforcement can ever be separated from its origins in slave patrols, union busting, and the suppression of civil rights movements. These are questions that settlements and training programs don't address. Questions that make people uncomfortable because the answers require fundamental change rather than incremental adjustment. Officer Ward lost his career. And that matters. Accountability matters. But the system that produced him continues. The training that shaped his assumptions continues. The culture that rewarded aggressive enforcement continues. And somewhere in America today, another Black professional is being stopped outside their workplace. Another officer is making assumptions based on race rather than behavior. Another person is being forced to choose between asserting their rights and avoiding escalation. Most of those encounters won't end with a $3.5 million settlement. Most won't end with the officer being fired. Most will end with a momentary humiliation, a brief violation, and no consequences at all. That's the system. That's the pattern. And that's why stories like Calvin Brooks matter even after they're resolved. Because the point isn't just to celebrate the rare moments of accountability. The point is to recognize how rare they are. How many factors had to align for Brooks to achieve the outcome he did? How many victims will never get that opportunity? The badge revealed Officer Ward's misconduct, but it didn't prevent it. And until the culture that produces officers like Ward is fundamentally transformed, The badges will continue to protect some people while exposing others to the very violations they should prevent. That's not justice. That's just documentation of injustice. And documentation, without transformation, is just evidence of a problem we've chosen not to solve. Do you think police culture can ever be reformed, or does it need to be rebuilt from scratch?